We're already having some guests come. This is great. I'm gonna just see if I can. Play some music. Why don't I do that? Everyone hear that? All right. All right, welcome to our reading. Katie says, so excited to hear you all and all your beautiful work. Yes, we're very excited. So thanks for coming. We got some attendees as well, but this is our first creative panel. We hear from both poets and fiction writers. So our first, so we're gonna read. Everyone's gonna go around for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for a Q&A. But our first reader is Emma Snyder from Linguistics, who will read poems titled The Body and Its Gardens, a creative reading. Please welcome Emma.
Hello. So I'm going to be reading a couple of poems from a compilation in progress that I'm currently working on that focus a lot on the body and setting that in comparison with natural spaces, and also talking a lot about how the body rejoins natural spaces. So time permitting, I'm going to read 3 or 4 from those, and I'm going to start with one called How to Hunt for Wild Garlic. Leave for nettles, while I read Keats in the morning to the mice bones and the basil. Without gloves again, it only hurts if you flinch, but I am a lack of conviction and you are a death grip. Tell me to stick to the vegetable patch, at least while you're gone. You've added hemlock to the herbs, castor to the curatives, and you haven't yet taught me to tell the maledict from the medicine. Come back early, arms full, nettles and wild garlic. Where are the blooms? They're still too young to bloom. Are you sure? They don't smell strong. They're milder, that's all. Have I ever been wrong? Bring me tea and feverfew when I don't leave bed tomorrow. Fill the house with the purple flowers you pocketed. Love me for the blood you put in my mouth, and bury me with crocuses in the casket. The next one is my little love poem to Sky Burial, called Dakma. I could promise you my silence if you bring me your loss, if you swear fealty to wonder of stone, of calcium, crafted to hold death in my arms until it becomes rictus, lime, and water in me. I am a heart in concentric circles. I am a stomach full of baby teeth. You required a respite from holy things, made me holy, made you worshippers to my temple. I am pregnant with the rot you gifted. It is the only time I am warm. The carrion birds come to greet me now, my lovers, their caresses extracting borrowed skin, flesh offerings, lifting you towards God, and darling, I still watch your bones. This third one is called New Growth. The leaves cover the earth thick, like a layer of makeup, like the last 2 years resting on my face. It's a shame I can't scrape the time as easily as I can the flower beds. It sits on my skin, decays its way into my bloodstream, through the veins, its worms chewing trails into the earth of my muscles, and I have so much mulch to clear before the tunnels collapse. When the leaves are gone, the bed looks newly ancient, corner that predated me, that I filled with roses. Scarlet night, royal amber, rock and roll, others I forgot the names of. Blue lavender to sort into jars come summer, chamomile, peppermint, the burning comfort of tea in August afternoons. Puddles of daffodils, Professor Einstein's, curled around ceramic pots, around stepping stones, a lonely bench. I want to paint a mural along the rough, cracking fence, but what says welcome, says final, more than magnolia trees mothered lives ago. They braid petals into hair as I read, root deep into my ribcage, come back home. And finally, I'll end with waking. Waking is a percussive measure, my heartbeat keeping pace with my alarms, the creaking of my upper and lower jaw softened like taffy to join, and must be pried apart again. One day my tongue will cleave to the roof of my mouth and refuse to part. No great loss, no difference, my voice no quieter than normal, but today I have a mouth still. I continue conducting, knees, hips, shoulders snapping in time, snapping into place, fingers rearticulating from their mass of a fist, spine uncurling from where it rested like some great centipede as I fell asleep and unbecame person became other. I am old, I am amorphous, I am elsewhere, and upon waking I am pain of bones twisting and rearranging, kaleidoscopic, pain of body contorting from contentment to captivity, pain of learning to organize my parts to be human again. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. That was great. Okay, our next reader is Amelia Hamerlynck from Anthropology, and their presentation is titled Hamburg, I Love You, But You Deserve Better, a poem.
Hello. So this poem is, I'm only doing one poem, but it's quite long and a little bit dense and also bilingual. And when I wrote it, I didn't know if it would ever see the light of day because I thought it was the weirdest damn thing I'd ever written. Some of you have already heard it that are here, but it turned out kind of polarizing. Like some people who I've shown it to really love it, and some people are like, this is too much or non-comprehensible or something. And so I was just kind of like, I have this poem, I don't know what to do with it. It begs a lot of questions. So maybe a symposium is a good setting for it because people get to ask me questions afterward. So this is like one of the only contexts where it feels kind of appropriate. Yeah, it's called Hamburg, I Love You, But You Deserve Better. And I hope you enjoy it. Hamburg, I love you, but you deserve better. I followed the dear Abbey lines to the letter and cast off my fetters and let go of worldly desires. But Hamburg, I can't give you my best, and you know it. I sense your disdain emanating from gutters that Aussies have flooded with cigarette ash and vomit. Scoffs lace your mighty underground's howls. You feel how half-hearted my dumb declarations. My country should also such train stations have, and yes, I have done a eaten. God bless the Turks. That's not how a healthy relationship works. The drag queens on Große Freiheit throw shade. My advances rejected by Frau Marmalade. Hamburg, I love you and your rainy seasons, but I never expatriate for the right reasons. To catch 40 winks in the Black Forest cradle, to memorize every Grimm-Brüder fable. Hamburg, maybe I should have gone to Bavaria instead to better appeal to my touristy leanings, my need for stupid Bierstein serendipity and not your rough Est du Nord authenticity. Hamburg, I love you, but I don't deserve you, and you don't deserve my incomplete love. Hamburg, maybe if I loved myself, I could love you the way that I need to. I could crawl into your ancient bed and emerge out the other end a fish head, and never once consider leaving this land of masculine flaws and feminine faults. My dopey accent consigned to oblivion, every consonant unclockable in my Streichholzschächtelchen. every craving curbed by your Philharmonic's rave reviews. Hamburg, make love to me in the small spaces, please. I'm ready, take me. Between the Baltics and the North Sea, between the new me and the old me. Cup my sallow cheeks in your briny hands in some corner of a shipping container. We'll be one of thousands, they'll never suspect. Or in the cavern where McCartney and Lennon once played, manic on speed, brown eyes dilated, bodies as shaky as my heartbroken bones, before the world sanctified them and discovered their secrets. Hamburg, I'm desperate here, I know it's too late. Hamburg, I want you to love me so bad, but I haven't given you a single reason to. You're a shameless city, but shame hangs hot in everything I do and everything I don't do, but maybe someday I'll come back to you. Please, tell me the Polizei won't turn me away for my 100,000 paper-cut crimes. Hamburg, despite it all, we've had some good times, haven't we? Forgive the Atlantic on my ugly face. Always a teacup away from tears these days. It'll be awkward at first, so ist das mit exes, but I believe in us. 'Cause Hamburg, you know me so well. I tell you everything after all, there's nobody else I can tell. I wander your streets softly confessing. Among many other wonderful things, you're a Protestant place and yet priest to my sins. I pretend I'm talking on the phone in English, just an American minding her business. But Hamburg, you and I know I'm imbuing your sidewalks with echoes of my teenage self, planting seeds in the parking decks that an older and wiser me will uncover. Here, my ill-fated Prague Spring lover. Here, the time a metrosexual asshole violated me on a park bench, subtly pressured me to flash into French. Here, clusters of air castles, as your people call them, daydreams in my inferior tongue. I was princess to these places. I was the woman I longed to be, and not the girl you see before you, teeth chattering, touch-starved and lonely, pissy and bitchy and useless. Hamburg, clink your bottle against mine one last time. Say Prost, keep your chin up, be merry and blithe. Guck mich doch mal an, Schatz. I'll carry you in my heart and in my hate. Here's to beautifully botching our brand new starts, to royally fucking up every clean slate.
All right, thank you so much. That was great. Okay, our next reader is Mia Vance, an English major whose presentation is titled We Make Magnificence, Original Poems for Page and Stage. Please welcome Mia.
Hello, hi everybody. Can you see and hear me okay? Thumbs up, great, thank you. Fantastic, good afternoon. I'm excited to share with you all today. First, before I begin, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. I count myself very lucky to be sharing the virtual stage with such fantastic talent today. And thank you to the poets who have already shared. So all the poems I'll be reading today have come out of my work with the KIDD workshop program this year. Most of them have gone through an extensive workshop guided revision process already, but some of them, it's about half and half actually. Two of them are a bit more fresh and so sort of still on the workshop table, and we'll probably get a little bit more editing before they are complete, if they ever are complete. But they felt important to share as reflections of the kind of work that I'm aiming to do. And so I'll actually start with the two freshest and work backwards toward the more refined. So this first one is called To Call Forth the Whale. To call forth the whale. 1. You must believe, at least, that the whale exists to begin with. Stone gray, blue, or bracken bruised, you cannot call her if your drums refuse to beat belief, and so I call her forth, quotidian and calm. Swallow salt and practice breathing in the deep end. Grow strong not with hope, but with knowing. 2. You must meet her where she is. You cannot call the whale from this far inland, so I pick apart the seam between sea and myself. Rubber-booted, safety-soled, I go. 3. You must not come palm up, empty-handed, but there is little she wants, and less she needs, so I pull 3 teeth, 2 thistles, 1 tangerine, and 24 lines of Friday night free verse. I pestle them all into powder. For you must call her by her name. Pronounce it right, all vowel. She will not answer to a driftwood dry facsimile. To summon, one must plumb one's depths and call forth the wail that the wail might answer. Thank you. So this next one is also bilingual. I'm excited to share that. I wrote it a while ago and then brought it to workshop this term. So it's sort of old and new. And it's English-Irish bilingual, and so it's a kind of a reflection of a life goal of mine, which is to gain more fluency with Gaeilge and to eventually write predominantly in English-Irish blend. So, and plus after calling forth the whale, this one's got a lot of ocean imagery, so it felt appropriate to put this one next in the lineup. So this is called Be Here, Be Here. I stand the farthest west I have been in over a year, up to my ankles in ocean, soaking my clothes and stare farther west than I've ever been. Listen for the whisper of home in the headwind, wait for the thunder of hooves in the hissing foam, but I know there are no couple in these waters. This Ishka Pacific ro ada too far, ro huan too quiet, I know. So I stand with a fistful of promised land, let Tir na Nog sift through the sieve of my fingers and find myself thinking of Ashin again, Again, oceans away, and the couple that carried him west, to be here with me of Kinor. I think of my great-great-great-grands on the wild Atlantic shore, with the wind at their backs and their sacks full of bad luck and famine, and across the sea the lady of amber waves is beckoning, beacon hand high. No choice left but to board the next boat going west from Cork to New York and beyond, to be here where I am now. But something plucks the harpstrings of the heart, strikes a homesick note unfiltered and bewildering, turns Ushin's eye from fields of gold and mine from the horizon, whispers Cheawalya, Ni Heisho Anbalya, go home. And I wonder, when the next flight leaves, will I catch it? And when I land, when I stand Erangosta here, Ella, that other west coast farther east than I've ever been, will it feel like coming home? Will I bury my 4 times great-granddad's old hatchet at last, back in the Talav, the land where it came from, when my feet find the earth? Will I age 100 years? For every one, I've been away, brittle-boned and wither-skinned, each nut-brown hair at last the silver lining I've been looking for. What will I say? What will I say to the saint that sits at my bedside waiting to take down my story? What myth will I leave in the time that I have, of the time it has taken to be here? Thank you. Halfway there. This next one is called Grandmother Spruce. So as a poet and as a person, I'm often deeply inspired by place. And this next piece is actually inspired by the space that rests beneath the giant Sitka spruce of Cape Perpetua, which, if you have not been, highly recommend. And as you might be able to tell from my previous poem, I'm also interested in the poetics of family lineage, and how poetry of place and poetry of family intersect. So this next poem is an exercise in that direction, and is an effort to connect the two. So here is Grandmother Spruce. A tree fell in the woods, and I am 600 years too late to hear the sound she made. But I have heard the spines of pine trees break enough times now to almost understand. She watched 600 hunter moons grow full, ripen, and empty while she lay this way, with roots exposed, outstretched on forest floor, before a conekin found the hollow of her throat and sprouted. The first one to fall bore up the smaller, named herself nurse, and called the other daughter. Ring by ring, 600 springs the seedling grew, each root enfolding, holding on as sapling waxed, and mother waned, decayed. And all that remains now is a giant that stood on the back of the giant before her, and the space underneath where the nurse ghost is. Space just enough for one little poet to sit and play seed in, to metaphor herself into the story. 600 centuries, 6 centuries of spruce above, 600 years too late. And 6 feet away stands my grandmother, half ghost, snow-peaked, fingers laced behind her, eyes upturned like midday daisies, smile uncurling like ferns. She turns to me, barley moon, blooming, a cone of my own caught in my throat. She says of the ancient pair, I wonder which one I am. And a twig snaps somewhere deep in the rings of my ribcage. She is the giant who bore up the giant who bore me, who bear up my own. She is a whole forest of old growth, and that is the size of the space she will leave. Thank you so much. I've got one more for you today. If you'll indulge me, you'll recognize the title of my presentation as one of its lines. It's another kind of family lineage poem, and it was the hardest poem I have ever written in my life. And without a shadow of a doubt, it would not have taken this form or come this far from where it started if it were not for the incredibly kind and supportive instruction of Michael Wilson and the caringly constructive feedback of my KIDD workshop cohort mates. So before I read it, I just wanted to say thank you once again for your time and attention today. And without further ado, I will leave you with Caesarean. And for my next trick, he says, I'll need a brave volunteer. The spotlight roves the darkened house pretending, but I was picked out in advance. Planted here midsection, 6th row back, 2 seats in, 40 weeks and counting, and when the light arrests on me, he smiles behind his mask, turns one gloved palm upward, open, says, ah yes, a round of applause for the brave lady. The audience obliges, and I rise, performing sheepish like she-wolf in my own clothing, backless gown. Let him spin me in sight of the crowd. Prove once and for all I am, in fact, a woman, alive, perfect and entire, and decidedly unsawn in half so far. Numb from waist down and nothing up our sleeves, he lays me back with slow hands, just like rehearsal. Though I make a little show of squirming for the crowd, let them know I have my doubts, but no fear. Yet, polite applause, half-hearted. A curtain drawn, then parted, just enough to show I haven't fled. My feet, my head, and the tender swell of belly there, and then the saw, real and raw, and medical grade, sleight-handed from thin air, the oldest trick in the book. But the audience stirs in earnest now, eager at the sight of all those teeth, hungry for blood, baying like hounds, restless and skeptic in suspense and disbelief. This is what they came for. They want to see me open, arrayed, flesh flayed in gore and glory, gutted, work themselves into a froth, a frenzy to be glutted on beautiful butchery, but they want more. They've seen this trick before. And laid out on the table, still separate from my legs, I watch the masked magician change his gloves. And now I am afraid. He breaks the pas de deux we practiced, sinks his sterile, steady hands into the cavity he carved, and I am seasick. Shipwreck in my belly weighs up anchor, flips me inside out and turns me top hat. My hands, two useless doves in cages, disappear, pulls an inconceivable rabbit. Alive. perfect and entire from the well of me. A chord is cut, a hush, shh, shh, falls over the crowd. The crowd filters out of the house, satisfied in clouds of blue balloons, chrysanthemums, they light cigars, each one suddenly my mother, my father, my sister, my friend, and you and I are skin to skin. My kith, and kin, your first cry, open mouth, my smile, my lips stretched wide as the new scar that splits me hip to hip. You are here. And presto changeo, I am instantly transfigured, can never be unmothered now. Ta-da! We make magnificence. Thank you all so much. That's the selection I have for you today, and I will now yield the screen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mia. That was great. Definitely for the stage. All right, our last reader is Sarah Kline, who will be reading their story, The Green Kingdom. Please welcome Sarah Kline.
Hi, this is an excerpt from my anthology story. I wrote this during winter term. Just for a little bit of background, this story is about Amara, the daughter, and her mother and grandmother, who are very much in opposition with one another, but Amara serves to bring them in connection and further in conflict with one another. If you hear pages rustling, I printed out my story because I read much better when it's a physical copy. My mother, Frances, was sitting on the ledge of the tub, her foot propped up on one knee, back arching towards her toes. Her eyes were fixated on the soles of her feet. I stood there, trying to understand the purpose of it all. I didn't say you could come in, she said. What are you looking at? I moved closer to her, looking at her soles, just like her eyes were. Small, black, raised dots freckled their feet, reminding me of the dandelions that scattered our front lawn. You have flowers on your feet, I smiled. I wouldn't call them that. She sighed, then put her foot down on the tile floor. Betha was right. Grandmother Betha? I asked. My mother would never admit to Grandmother Betha's knowledge. My shoes aren't fitting right. I have warts on my feet, and I'm always inside. Grandmother Betha would tell you to go barefoot. My mother Frances finally looked up at me, her lips rolling back to reveal slightly yellowed teeth, which my grandmother said came from the coffee stains of capitalism covering what was once clean. She stood and rested her palm on my shoulder. Cup of noodles for dinner? She asked, then walked out of the bathroom. The next day at my grandmother's, I asked her what a wart was. She shook her head and the maple rustled, sending a shiver down my spine. It wasn't long before the red Subaru pulled up and my mother came into view. I wished I could warn her about what was to come. Surprised to see you still have your shoes on, my grandmother Betha said. Why would I not? She asked, back rigid and tall. I knew yesterday you were hiding it. I can feel you are unwell, my grandmother replied. My mother's eyes flamed, but her brow remained flat and she stayed quiet, though her words were ever clear in the silence. I stood by my grandmother, nudging her with my elbow, begging her to stop. This time, she didn't listen, even as a maple wrestled with me. It's a desk job. You are always inside. Walking barefoot on the grass will heal it, you know. The dew does all of the work. When my mother Frances's eyes turned towards me, I wanted to escape in the fields behind the blue house. My safety was there. For the first time ever, her eyes cut me dry. Get in the car, Amara. Now, she said, chilling my bones with her severity. We're leaving. I knew that job of yours wouldn't work out, Grandmother Betha continued. Who said I was quitting? I'm perfectly satisfied with my choices. Are you? My mother Frances inquired. There's only one way to make it go away. I'm a grown adult. I've made the choice not to live like you, so let it go, my mother Frances said. You were always so against my lifestyle, my grandmother Betha said, the breeze blowing a strand of hair that hung over her face. Forgive me for wanting a better life for my child. I want to give her the things that she wants. My mother took a couple steps towards my grandmother as she spoke. My mother Frances was taller, but my grandmother Betha stood as solid as a trunk. She could be frightening whenever needed. Did I teach you nothing about living simply? My grandmother's face wrinkled in disdain. Why are you so stubborn? I do not have to live like you. Except that we are different, and we always will be. My mother Frances crossed her arms. I have. Have you bothered to ask Amara what she wants? She's my daughter, and I will decide. Give it up. Not for Amara's sake, my grandmother asserted. God forbid she ever gets sick, but if she does, at least I'll be able to afford the treatment. At least I want to get her the help she'd need. My mother Frances spat the words out on the gravel, sizzling in the summer heat like the anger in her fists, despite the block in her throat. That's what he wanted. It's what we wanted. As Grandmother Betha spoke, her eyes were no longer her own. I learned I wasn't a part of that we when you made that decision without me, my mother Frances said. Forgive him, forgive it, Grandmother Betha stated. My mother Frances was inaudible over the scratching of the maple's limbs on the roof, but I could feel her might. My grandmother Betha was not listening, for I could see it in her eyes. For the last time, I'm not taking that tree down. You know what it means to me. My grandmother's voice was suddenly detached. Dad can't come back as a tree, my mother Frances shouted, the fingers of her left hand locked in. He's gone because of your choice. You are lost on me, Grandmother Betha said, eyes blank. We're leaving now, and we aren't coming back tomorrow, my mother said, muffled through the closed door of the car. My back sank into the leather of the back seat, the words hitting my chest, caving in at its ring. She got in the car, turned the key, and sped off with no care how the upturned gravel might scratch her car. Her eyes did not check me in the rearview mirror. When we arrived home, she opened her mouth as the door shut behind us. Never tell Grandmother Betha anything unless I ask you to. My mother looked down at me. I'm sorry, I said, and she went to sit on her bed. Even through the walls, her sorrow reached me. She stayed there for a while, and I stole some bread from the counter to fashion her a peanut butter and jelly. I set the paper plate next to her on the duvet, the blinds drawn, to block out the sinking sun, orange in the faded blue. Her hands were folded on her lap, her gold charm bracelet catching a ray of light seeping through the cracks in the blinds. Her father's bracelet that she never once took off. Maybe he can come back as a tree, I said. I sank down on the mattress next to her, my legs hanging off the edge. Whatever brings her comfort. She didn't touch the sandwich until she looked at me. I'm sorry I don't know your father anymore. Trees are enough for me, I replied, with not a hint of a lie. But Amara, a tree is not a proper father, she said, as she touched the sandwich to her teeth. Could be, if you imagine it to be. I turned the corners of my mouth up. My mother Frances laughed with a mouthful full of peanut butter and jelly. Everything is better in your mind, she swallowed a smile at me, jelly seeds between her two front teeth. The following morning, my mother Frances went to work and left the key on the counter next to a pre-made lunch of peanut butter and jelly and a note that read as goes. Our neighbor Stacy will be by to check on you. Knock on her door if you need anything more. I sat on the sunken couch and pulled out the book my grandmother Betha had lent me, full of pictures of trees. Looking at them wasn't enough. I wanted to know the sounds of their leaves. So I laid on the floor and stared at the ceiling, fabricating a green kingdom like the one in my grandmother Betha's backyard, full of magical beings. The trees danced and swayed in the sunny breeze of abundance, singing a song only for me. This time I listened hard like my grandmother would, and kept my ground like my mother would. The ceiling started to fade as the trees sang to me the simplicity of being. I took off my socks to feel the dirt at my feet, the roots extending up to my hips, grounding me in peace. Then my mother turned the key in the lock, reminding me I was not in the world beyond, and the roof returned to its constructed position. Amara, what are you doing on the floor? Nothing, I muttered. The Green Kingdom was just for me. My mother Frances brought home a pizza for us to share. She propped up her feet on the coffee table and turned on the TV, grabbing a slice from the greasy cardboard box. The pictures on the screen disrupted me. They are far too glossy to be real. I sat facing away from them, retreating into my grandmother's picture trees. They seemed to know so much more than me, and even in those shiny images, their peace reached out to me. Mom, do you love Grandmother Betha? The question escaped my lips during commercial break. She's so stubborn, my mother Frances replied. We will never see eye to eye. You know, you still refuse to dance with me on the lawn, and she still refuses to let me inside the house, I said, to which she remained silent. The following Saturday morning in late October, my mother Frances went out on the lawn. She waltzed back and forth, twirled and spun, barefoot on the green. I sat there, crisscross, imagining her as a tree in my book. She danced all day, and even as the sun sank in the sky and I took myself to bed, she kept her feet twirling on the lawn. That Sunday morning, my mother's bed had no imprints of her body from a night of sleep. There was no sign where she had gone. I ran to the lawn, where I last laid eyes on her, and a fungus had sprouted overnight. The mushroom had an orange top and white spots, raised, like the flowers that once covered my mother's feet. Her gold charm bracelet was sparkling on the green next to it. Mom, I said, and the mushroom grew. My mother's body never returned to the way my eyes once knew her. Thank you so much for listening.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. That was great. All right, so if you're an audience member, you can type in your question in the Q&A and I will read it. So we already got some great ones from Lou. But just to start things off, I just want to ask, and this is for everybody, just talk a little bit about your inspiration for the poem or story you read, and what the writing process was like. And we'll start with Amelia.
I don't even remember writing this at this point. So the inspiration was actually a song called New York, I Love You, But You're Bringing Me Down, which is one of my favorite songs of all time because it's just incredibly oddly specific to this person's life experience, but it still makes me cry. Like, I can't relate to it in any capacity, but for some reason the song is really powerful and emotional to me. And I love the idea of like a city being a character, kind of with like a personality that you can talk to as though it's a person. And so eventually it just kind of clicked in my brain that like it would be a good idea to like process and come to terms with stuff that had happened to me in Germany through like a similar format of like talking to a city. And so that's like that song was the main inspiration. There's also, Lana Del Rey actually wrote a poem called LA, Who Am I to Love You? So this is basically just like me hearing that poem and that song and being like, oh, I can do that, but with like this city that means something to me. So as far as inspiration, it's like pretty basic, but I think like I needed to be at peace with things. I'm kind of being vague on purpose, and this poem was like a way of me doing that. So yeah.
Awesome. Emma, what about you? What was your inspiration for some of the poems you read, and also the process of writing them?
Yeah, I think a lot of my inspiration came from the fact that I do feel really connected to nature, and then getting put into a position this year with a lot of things shut down and staying at home that I would go a lot longer stretches without being in it. So I think definitely this was partially homesickness, my own brand of homesickness for missing specific places and the plants and nature that I associated with each of them. And I didn't really intend for it to be until I kind of looked back at the work that I had done with KIDD and realizing that it all really did kind of fall under the like my friend called it bugs, bones, and botany. And so it was fun. I found a little brand for myself along the way.
Yeah, I mean, you also have a lot of like visceral imagery, like the stomach full of baby teeth. Like, where does that come from?
Some of that I honestly couldn't even tell you. I'm a poet. I'm a chronically ill poet. I write about my chronic illness a lot, and so that definitely comes with some weird visceral sensations that I end up putting in writing. A lot of it would just be a late night and getting one very strange visceral image, like the stomach full of baby teeth, and going, oh, this needs to go somewhere, and then trying to find a home for it.
Awesome. Interesting. Sounds interesting. Mia, you talked a little bit about your inspiration and process, but maybe you can just expand on it for a few of your poems.
Sure. Gosh, I mean, a lot of them were directly prompted by our instructor in the KIDD workshop environment. Caesarean was my first ever attempt at a persona poem, for example, and I mean, part of what we did with that type of exercise is to look at what a persona poem can do for us. And something that struck me about that practice is that it can be a vehicle to explore something that might otherwise be very difficult to talk about at all, let alone make any art out of. And so it was for me kind of a way into an experience that is both a difficult memory and something that's difficult to articulate and talk about without oversharing. And so, things like that. Grandmother Spruce, I think, was also prompted by Michael. But it's a great example of I recalled that experience of being literally underneath this 600-year-old giant tree, and just sort of like what Emma was saying. There's some experiences you have, and you just think like there's a poem in here somewhere, and so sometimes it just takes time to bring it out and to find what form it wants to take and what language it wants to use, which I think is part of why I want to do bilingual poetry in the future, is having more language with which to speak those stories and speak those experiences, and to find which language it feels most at home in. I think that just about covers it. To call forth the whale was a Friday night free verse moment. It was a writing exercise. I said to myself, "You just finished your LOI and you have a poem due, so sit down, baby. You got to write something." And so, calling forth the whale is kind of a metaphor for both for manifesting something for yourself, to call something forth in your life, to call forth kind of those difficult things that you might need to deal with. So trauma, calling forth the trauma, but also just kind of summoning forth the creative writing to summon forth a poem when you're exhausted and you've got a deadline. So that's kind of where calling forth the whale came from.
The muse often visits during deadlines, so I'm glad that they arrived. Sarah Kline, what about you? What did the genesis for your story come from, and maybe just talk about a little bit about the process of writing it?
Yeah, this question is very hard for me to answer because this story is kind of like three ideas that I had like combined into one. I don't really have a very good structure set up for writing stories. I just kind of randomly get ideas and then we'll sit down and write them. So this story originally started very drastically different. It was supposed to be a like creative nonfiction story and dedication to my grandmother. And then it changed a lot and I started adding in two other story ideas that I had just as I was writing. And Similar to Amelia, I was also inspired by a song that I was listening to when I was writing. I was listening to Hard Drive by Cassandra Jenkins, I think, and that song just like is a lot about nature and letting go of things, and that just really changed what the story was about. So I kind of wove that, well, tried to, into my story. But yeah, that kind of sums it up.
Yeah, it seems like writing is about Frankensteining different things together and making it work. All right, so again, the audience can ask questions, and so we'll start with Lou's holding it down. So let's start with Lou's first question for Emma. I'm so amazed by your imagery. It's mesmerizing, strange, and yet it finds such a lovely home in the poems. How do you select your images and find balance in the light and the dark? And where do you find inspiration? I just asked that. So yeah, you could answer that, Emma.
Sure. I think balance in the light and the dark is something that has been a long time journey for me. And looking back at a lot of my old writing, I leaned a lot more heavily into dark imagery, as I'm sure a lot of us that started writing young kind of did for a while, and was inspired by a lot of poets like Poe and Lovecraft and Hawthorne that kind of dealt with darker, scarier moments. And it's a more decently recent thing that I'm trying to take that and synthesize that with beautiful moments, because I think the beautiful moments in life are important and so necessary to note down when they happen. So just trying to find ways to take, if I can return to nature again, like the beauty and the danger in nature. Some of the most beautiful plants are plants that are very dangerous, and just having that little, feeling out where the balance is, but definitely making sure both elements always have their place.
All right, great, thanks. The next question is for Amelia. Lou says, wow, I am always floored when you read this poem. I'd really love to hear more about writing a love poem to something huge and human. What was it like emotionally? Also, how did the refrains work for you in this poem? What made that choice come about?
So the refrains are really like what I was saying about the song and the poem that both inspired this. I think I really admired how those works used refrain, especially when you're writing something like, not only is it very rambly and kind of unstructured, not only is it like bilingual, and also kind of oddly specific to like one experience, and filled with like references and stuff. And so it's a little bit overwhelming, I think, especially if you're like not hearing me read it, if you just like read it on the page. And I like how refrains like ground you. It's like you're digging through this like really dense, kind of like strange, unfamiliar poem, and then it brings it back with like really simple phrases. And I kind of like poetry that oscillates like that between like, here's a really explicit single simple line that like tells you what it means. And that's like what the Hamburg I love you ones are. And then like flowing back into like the really kind of more difficult or like challenging or strange parts of the text. In terms of writing to something huge and inhuman, I think that almost made it easier than if I was trying to write for a person. Like this poem is kind of a blend of personal experience and like massive exaggeration. And one thing that is actually true is like me feeling like I have no one to talk to. And so I walk around and pretend I'm on the phone and talk to my surroundings. I'm crazy. Like, like at hard times in my life, I do that a lot. And it's easier to address that, to direct that to like your surroundings sometimes than it is to communicate to a human being, especially if you feel as though no one could possibly understand you, or if you feel as though you would feel guilty like talking about your feelings or your experiences or whatever. And so, yeah, I think like addressing it to the city was like not challenging. Like I think it made it a lot easier to process.
Great, thanks. Our next question is for Mia. Lou, again, I think one of the things that stands out most in your poetry is your ability, investment, in myth making. Your discussion of place and family really solidifies this for me. Could you talk more about negotiating memory with writing, with drama, with invention?
Lou, how did you know I used to be a theater major? Girl, you know me. You know me somehow. Oh, that's a big question. Thank you for that. So I think the easy, like the simplest answer is that I think that myth making can be an amazing way to process kind of what I was talking about with Caesarean, a way to process something difficult or something just tricky to navigate in other forms. But to kind of expand on that, I guess, I think humans create myth out of need. I think that that need can be sometimes just to explain something unexplainable, or to try to make sense of something that that might not otherwise make any sense. Humans experience so many different things, and making sense of those things feels important, and sometimes feels also just so impossible. And so I think it comes sense of this. How do I contextualize this in a way that I can handle, or in a way that I can explain? So I think when you find mythology that you resonate, that you didn't create, I think that can be extremely empowering. And I think when you can then engage with that mythology on a personal level, that can be personally really healing. And then when you can find a way to kind of create mythology out of your experience, that you haven't already encountered out in the world, I think that's another step towards kind of addressing a human need, whether it's just for yourself, or when you share it with others. Sometimes there's potential to fulfill a need in someone else that you might never have foreseen otherwise. And so I think that that memory comes into play there in processing things that have happened, in kind of creating space for things that you desire to happen, things you long for, things you miss, people you miss. Um, and I think the drama that comes into it, or the invention that comes into it, my old theater professor used to say that, and in fact my husband does too sometimes, say that when you're on stage, when you're performing in character, it's the only time that that character is given a body and a voice to speak with. And sometimes poetry feels that way for me, is that this is the way that this thing or this entity or this energy is going to be given a body or a space or a voice with which to express whatever it needs to express. Yeah, and so that's I mean, that's the goal. That's the best of times. That's what poetry can be, I think.
Great answer. Well, thanks. Now this next question is for Sarah, from Lou again. Thank you, Lou. I was really taken with how developed each character felt, even in this short space. When dealing with multiple main characters, how do you balance details, character? Where do you position them in orbit if the plot story sits in the middle as the sun?
Thank you for this question. Honestly, in the first draft, there was not a very equal balance between the main characters, and that was definitely something that I got a lot of feedback on from my KIDD workshop peers. So I honestly credit a lot of the fact that they sort of maybe now feel a little bit balanced on the feedback I got from them. But I think I still struggle particularly with the main character, Amara, because she is somewhat like in the middle between them. That was definitely a challenge for me when writing. But I think I particularly like to characterize through the dialogue. So I try to do that to the best of my ability, but I do think that within short spaces, maintaining the characterization through the dialogue is really beneficial for me, or it's a way that I like to characterize.
Great. And this next one's from Jen. Sarah, what aspect of this story draws you in the most as the writer? What part did you find most pleasurable to write, and what was most difficult?
Thank you for this question as well. I think to answer the second part of this question, I think my answer is the same for both. The most difficult part kind of relates to Lou's question as well. In my first draft, the mother as a character was the most underdeveloped, and it was very difficult for me to pin down her character and include a scene with her and Amara. So that I really struggled with writing because I wasn't sure to what extent I wanted the mother to be some like cold character. But in the scene that flourished from that, I found that most pleasurable to write when they're both sitting on the bed. And I feel like that's when I really figured out more what I wanted this story to go direction wise. But I think the aspect of this story that draws me the most in is probably the magical realism in terms of like the mother turning into the mushroom and the whole, I guess, for lack of a better word, like magical aesthetic of the Green Kingdom and what that means for nature.
Great, thanks. And I guess I have one question for the people that use multilingual things in their poems. Like, how do you approach using a different language, and if you come from that culture, using, bridging the gap in your poetry between maybe two audiences or two languages? This is for, I guess, Amelia and Mia.
I don't know that I like succeeded in that with this poem, honestly. I still kind of doubt it a lot. So yeah, I'm not sure how to answer. I think like we did one KIDD talk where I don't remember who was hosting, but they said like Google exists and so your reader can Google it and you don't need to worry about that. Which I think is like a cool attitude. And I kind of wish I was that badass, but I also think accessibility is important. And so I think like with my poem, I don't like worry about it too much because I think it's relatively like sparse. Like there's a lot going on in the poem and like comparatively there aren't as many words. I think if I were to attempt something more ambitious, it might give me like more to think about in terms of like who's the audience for this, who would be able to read this and all that stuff.
What about you, Mia?
Oh gosh, I'm not going to remember who said this wonderful quote, but I feel like it was in the Poetry Ireland collection that was dedicated to Seamus Heaney a year or two ago, a couple years ago, that talked about the use of, or the addressing of Irish language in poetry that's written in English. And the quote was something to the extent of that the use of the Irish language will always be, to a certain extent, political, because of its background. It was suppressed rather violently historically, and so to see it reemerge, or to sort of come back out of hiding in a way, has been something that I feel very passionate about, and it's been very difficult as an American on this coast, trying to learn the language. There are very few resources available. I even tried to convince U of O to help me with this for my language requirement, and they struggled. So French it is. But so I feel very strongly that it's important for it's historically important, it's culturally important, for me to try to connect with this language of my ancestral background, that was it was nearly kind of brought low by the language I am speaking right now, and so I feel like one way to honor that is with poetry. I don't know as many. I don't know as much of the language as I'd like to, and so my use of it in my poetry is very minimal at this point. But what I would love to see in the future is for it to be incorporated more and more as I learn. And so right now I don't really have a process of how to, half the poem's going to be Irish and half's going to be English. It really is just kind of like, I know the word water, so I'm going to use the word water, and I know the word horse, and I'm going to use the word horse. And it's just my small way of taking that first step toward telling this language and telling this culture and telling my own ancestors, I see you and I hear you, and I'm going to try to give you a voice in what small ways I can in the time that I have.
Great, Mia. Thanks. That was lovely. So that's the last question, because we should wrap up soon, but I guess it's for everybody. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about your transformation in the KIDD program from when you first got here to the kind of writer you are now. How did you see yourself changing through the course of the year? We can start with Amelia.
I think I answered this yesterday, and I'm trying to think of like a different creative thing to say. But I mean, I definitely gained confidence. Like the class is just so like warm and supportive and kind, and so is Lou, and that's been incredible. I don't like self-deprecate about my art anymore, which is wonderful. I don't feel like embarrassed to talk about writing poetry, which I think is especially important for like women poets to learn how to do. And I am more like, I talked about this yesterday, but like I'm more attuned to like how poems work. I feel like I can read more things now and understand them better, because it's given me like an eye and an ear for noticing like details about a poem and like methods for analyzing poetry, which is really cool because it's hard to read a lot of the time. So yeah, I've gained more confidence and learned more about this craft. Yeah.
Cool, thanks. What about you, Emma?
I would say that confidence is definitely a huge factor of being in KIDD. It is such a warm, genuinely kind group of people that I've gotten to interact with. And it's just, I mean, workshops were the highlight of my week, of getting to come in and talk to people about their writing and get their feedback on mine. And also just being able to be motivated to create so much more work than I would were I not here. I'm a person that I'm very inspired by being around creative people. It very much helps me in my creative process to be around really talented people, and that's definitely what I've gotten to do through this year. So it's been amazing.
Awesome, glad to hear it. What about you, Sarah?
I have a very similar point to make about the supportive community and being around other creative people, because it's really inspired me. And also hearing the visiting writers that we had, that was also very inspiring. And I've truly never had this many story ideas before, so it's kind of been hard to have time to jump on all of them. But overall, this KIDD program has really made me so much more of a conscious writer, and when I do sit down to write, I feel like I'm more aware of all the components of the story and more devices to use to have my story go a certain route. But mainly just the community has been truly outstanding.
Awesome, great to hear it. What about you, Mia?
Something that has, I think what has struck me the most about participating in the KIDD workshop program is that I've really developed a love of revision, which I was not expecting. Used to hate it, don't want to do it, don't make me do it. I just want to put the words down and have them be perfect, and if they're not, it's a bad poem, we'll move on. But that's not allowed in the KIDD program. You have to edit, you have to take that feedback, and you have to be brave. I really appreciated the element of bravery on the revision rubric. And it's something I repeated to myself whenever I sat down to revise a piece of work of, you have to be brave. You have to be bold about how you're going to reshape this, and take the feedback that feels most helpful. And I've just really seen that practice at work, to be able to bring a poem that either I feel very confident about, and sort of nervous then to give it to the workshop cohort mates, and knowing that they're going to tell me, here's something that might make it better, despite how perfect you might already think it is. Or to bring a piece that feels rather messy, maybe hopeless, and to have the wonderful supportive group come back and tell you, it's not hopeless. Here's some suggestions. Here's some questions I have for this poem. Maybe think about that when you sit down to work with it again. Don't just throw it away. It's not garbage, And so I did not realize when I came into this that I was going to come out loving revision so much. And that helps sometimes when I sit down to write, knowing that if it's having difficulty coming out, if it's not perfect the first time around, that's what revision is for. And it's fun and it works. And you can be brave. You can do it.
That's a wonderful thing to learn. Yeah, writing is rewriting a lot of times, so that's great to hear. All right, well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for all the great reading we've had. This was awesome. So our next reading is at 5:15. Let me just make sure that is true. Yeah, 5:15. So we'll hear from Jack Dinovitz, Madeline Fellman, Ava Blake, and Aaron Barron, I think. Andrew Barron, that's it. So please join us for that. But in the meantime, we'll see you at 5:15. So thank you.